Thousands of years ago, out of the darkness of prehistory, the first human civilizations began to appear on Earth. These early civilizations appeared in widely scattered parts of the world. A great civilization was born, for example, in Egypt, while others appeared in Asia, and still others in the south of Europe around the Mediterranean Sea. And at about the time that the mighty Roman Empire was near its height, people in a beautiful, faraway land were about to step out of the mist and into the light of history. Then, out of the primitive vastness of the American continents, came the great civilizations of the ancient Americans. The first people to live in the Americas came from Asia through Alaska, about 30,000 years ago. During the last ice age, when much of the world's ocean water was frozen into huge glaciers and ice sheets, there existed a strip of dry land between Asia and Alaska, in an area that today is covered by ocean. It is believed that wandering tribes of hunters crossed this land bridge into America. They were following herds of animals which they hunted for food. For the first Americans lived by hunting and gathering, which means they obtained food through hunting or fishing, and by gathering wild plants they could eat. These hunters and gatherers were not yet civilized. Civilization began after a very important shift in the way they got their food, the shift to farming. By about 6000 BC, some people began to raise certain wild plants as crops. Farming or agriculture allowed people to settle down and live in one place. They no longer wandered over the earth in search of food. They settled in villages and raised crops. Of these crops, one was destined to become the most important of all, corn, or maize as the Indians called it. The development of civilization in the New World would be based on this plant. As people settled down to farm, they began to build permanent houses like this one. And as more people took up farming, villages grew into large towns. Agriculture and living in towns are the first steps toward becoming civilized. Living in settlements with plenty to eat, people began to have more time. They began to have enough time to make beautiful things. Artisans became adept at working with clay, wood, and metals. Art is another sign of civilization. Other marks of civilization are social organization, trade, and a knowledge of math and science. And finally, civilized people usually have a written language. The first American farmers may have lived here in southern Mexico and Central America, an area we call Mesoamerica. By 1000 BC, civilization was emerging in Mesoamerica. Now we will look at one expression of that civilization, the ancient Mayas. These are Maya Indians today. Living in Guatemala and southern Mexico, they number in the millions. Most work the land in the way of their ancestors, planting corn, beans, and squash. For over the centuries, little has changed for the Maya. Some women even use the traditional grinding stones, the mano and metate, to grind their corn into flour. All of these habits are part of the modern culture of the Maya. They are justly proud of their culture and their past, for it was the ancestors of these humble peasants who created one of the world's greatest civilizations. Buried deep in the jungles of Mesoamerica, the ancient civilization of the Mayas was lost from memory for hundreds of years. In fact, almost nothing was known of this lost civilization until 1839, when two jungle explorers discovered what seemed to be the remains of ancient walls hidden in the forest. As they cleared away the trees and vines, strange buildings began to take shape. One of the explorers, John Stevens, described the ruins as lost, buried, and unknown, never before visited by a stranger. He said, all was dark, impenetrable mystery. Fortunately, Stevens' companion, Frederick Catherwood, was an artist and made detailed drawings like this one of everything they saw. But it would take scientists another century to begin to understand the history of the Mayas. The beginning of Maya civilization is still shrouded in mystery, but scientists believe that it grew in part from a still older civilization called the Olmec. Hidden in jungle on the Gulf of Mexico, explorers have found huge carved heads, curious remains of the lost Olmec civilization. Some of these heads are 9 feet tall and weigh over 20 tons. Explorers have also found Olmec masks carved from pure jade, one of the hardest stones known to man. Olmec craftsmen must have worked thousands of hours to carve and polish jade figures such as these. The Olmecs were highly civilized, produced fine carvings, and even had a written language, but mysteriously, in about 300 BC, the Olmec civilization disappeared. As the Olmecs passed from the scene, the Mayas, who had lived for centuries in these tropical forests, began to build a new civilization. By about AD 100, stone temples were beginning to rise above the trees. The Mayas lived here, in eastern Mesoamerica. They established a network of cities such as Huaxactún, Bonampak, Palenque, and in the south, Copan. And in the center of this network lay the fabled city of Tikal. Tikal was a stunning city, crowded with exotic temples, palaces, and plazas. By AD 700, the city sprawled across 10 square miles. Rising from the primitive rainforest, Tikal must have seemed like a vision from a dream. Most of the buildings were plastered and painted red, and their tops were decorated with wildly painted carvings. Today, Tikal is a mysterious ruin, almost completely swallowed by jungle. Trees and vines cover most of the buildings, but if one looks closely at the ruined walls, bits of the original plaster and red paint can still be seen. Hundreds of scientists, called archaeologists, have spent many years studying these ruins, searching for clues about the ancient Mayas. Some of the main buildings have been cleared of trees and vegetation. The tallest buildings were the religious temples. Near the temples, large palaces were set gracefully around lovely open courtyards. Archaeologists are not sure what the palaces were used for. They could have been residential houses where the priests and rich people lived, or they could have been government office buildings used by the rulers. Pictures of the rulers were carved onto large stone monuments called stelae, which were erected near the temples and palaces. The narrow court between these sloping walls was used to play a kind of sacred ball game. Every Maya city had at least one, and often several, of these ball courts. Ball games were played throughout Mesoamerica in ancient times. As in soccer, the game was played without the use of hands. A rubber ball was struck with the knees, hips, and elbows. Rubber came from the sap of the rubber tree. The Maya sliced the bark and collected the sap that ran out. Archaeologists believe that Tikal, like other Mayan cities, was a ceremonial center, which means that most of the large buildings we see today were used for religious ceremonies. The most important ceremonies were performed by the highest-ranking members of society, the noble priests. They ruled over Maya society. The highest priest of all was known as the true man. He was like a king and ruled over everyone in the city. The existence of these social classes, rulers, priests, and common people, is a good example of social organization. We can see what the noble priests looked like when they were dressed up for a ceremony. Such fantastic costumes must have set the nobles apart from the average Maya, for most people were ordinary farmers. Like the Maya of today, they spent long days tending their fields. And they lived in simple houses like this one, made of sticks, covered with mud. And like the Maya of today, they traded in large public markets. All of the cities like Tikal had such markets, where ordinary people could trade the surplus from their gardens for things they might need. On some days, the men would walk out into the jungle in search of meat for the evening meal. Above them, monkeys looked down from the safety of the treetops, keeping a watchful eye on the hunters. But the hunters had their minds on easier game, perhaps a wild turkey, venturing out to feed in a clearing. On a good day, they would capture several of these beautiful birds, taking them back alive to their houses. But on a bad day, they might return home empty-handed. Good days and bad days. These were not mere figures of speech to the ancient Maya, for all of Maya life was built around the idea that some days were naturally good and some were bad, and only a priest could foretell which was which. To do this, a priest consulted a special ritual calendar, which listed all of the days in a ritual year. Inside the circles are symbols for different days, some good and some bad. For example, this day, called Imish, was a good day. Good days were set aside for important work, such as planting. But this day, called Simi, represented by a face with the closed eyes of a dead person, forecast bad luck or even death. So this was not a good day to do anything important. The Maya actually had two calendars. One calendar, a solar calendar, contained 18 months of 20 days each, making 360 days. To this were added 5 unlucky or bad days, making a total of 365 days, just as in our calendar. The other calendar was the ritual calendar, which contained only 260 days. These two calendars turned together like two wheels so that each day a different pair of names was brought together. Each new day was named according to its position on both calendars. For example, this day is 4 Uaya Bimish. In this system, the exact same day only repeats every 52 years, marking 1 century of Mayan time. Many days on the Mayan calendar were set aside for religious ceremonies, which often involved blood offerings to the gods. In piercing his skin with the point of a spear, a priest would offer the vital stuff of life, his own blood. Here the ruler, or true man, is piercing his tongue with a large thorn. The Mayas believed that blood offerings and even human sacrifice were necessary to keep the universe in balance and to keep the wheels of time turning. The Maya were fascinated by the passage of time. They observed the sun as it passed through the sky, and they recorded the cycles of the moon and the planets. Their observations were so precise that they were able to accurately predict eclipses of the moon. For over 1,000 years, the Maya civilization flourished, marked by beautiful art, scientific advancement, and brilliant architecture. But in about 900 AD, the civilization went into a steep decline. No one knows why the civilization fell apart. Perhaps the common people revolted against the noble priests who had become rich and corrupt. Whatever the cause, the great centers like Tikal, Palenque, and Copan were abandoned, and grass began to grow over the temples and palaces. The people moved north to the sunny Yucatan and built new cities, which looked very different from the classic Mayan cities, because they were influenced by a foreign people who invaded from Mexico, a people called the Toltec. From the Toltec, the Maya learned a violent, deadly form of religion. While the brilliant civilization of the classic Maya grew dim, faded from memory, and sank beneath the jungle. The sound of Indian drums echoes today in the heart of Mexico City as dancers reenact the ceremonies of their ancestors. The sacred steps recall a time when feathered warriors invaded the Valley of Mexico, bringing their fierce customs and violent religion. But only one of these tribes would become famous, burned indelibly into history, a people we now call the Aztecs. The Valley of Mexico lies here in the highlands of southern Mexico. It is a broad basin surrounded by high mountains, and in ancient times it contained a large lake called Lake Texcoco. This was the center of great civilizations long before the time of the Aztecs, and to understand the Aztecs, we must take a look at these earlier civilizations. Set on a broad plain in the Valley of Mexico, ancient Teotihuacan is one of the most striking sights in the world. When the Aztecs found these ruins, they were stunned by the enormous pyramids, the rows of temples, and the broad avenues. They thought the place must have been built by gods, so they named it Teotihuacan, which means the home of the gods. As this model shows, the palaces and plazas were laid out in perfect order on each side of a grand avenue. The city must have struck awe in the minds of the Indians who saw it for the first time. On festival days, they could climb the Great Pyramid of the Sun, which loomed like a mountain over the city. It was made of millions of mud bricks covered with a layer of volcanic rock. Looking down from the top of the pyramid, one could see the city laid out. At its height, in 650 AD, some 200,000 people lived here, sprawled over 8 square miles. They lived in apartment houses connected by narrow streets and alleys. It has been estimated that there were about 3,000 apartment houses with 60 to 100 people living in each house. Nearly all of the houses were plastered and painted in a bright color, usually red. Even after 14 centuries, plaster and paint still cling to the old walls. Inside the palaces, the wall decorations were lavish. Here the rain god scatters drops of water, while his priests pour streams of corn onto the earth. This goggle-eyed god, covered with corn, was called Tlaloc. He was the god of rain and harvest, while this is Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, a god that is half bird and half snake. These were two of the most important gods, not only in Teotihuacan, but throughout Mesoamerica. For unknown reasons, in about the year 700 AD, the sun began to set on the civilization of Teotihuacan. People moved away, and parts of the city were burned. By the year 750, after more than 1,000 years of splendor, the last people left, and the city fell silent. To the north and west of the Valley of Mexico lay an area of dry hills and canyons that extended for hundreds of miles to the north. This desolate area was called the Gran Chichimeca, and it was the home of a wild and fierce people called Chichimec, which means the sons of the dog. For hundreds of years, Chichimecs had been migrating down from the northern plains and mixing with the civilized tribes already living in the Valley of Mexico. And from this mixture of people arose a society of warriors, the powerful Toltec. Their capital, called Tula, was set atop a broad ridge about 50 miles north of the Valley of Mexico. These ruins are all that remain of the great capital of the Toltecs, but in 1000 AD, the city looked much like this. From this beautiful capital, the Toltecs extended their influence throughout Mesoamerica. They ruled their subjects through military might. Subject peoples were forced to give food and valuables to the rulers, a kind of payment called tribute. On a large raised platform in the center of the main plaza, enemies captured in battle were sacrificed to Toltec gods. A victim's heart was cut out and placed on a specially carved altar called a chacmul. As we will see, the Aztecs adopted this practice of human sacrifice and made it the center of their religion. For unknown reasons, Tula, the city of warriors, declined in power and eventually collapsed. Some believe that it was simply overwhelmed by later waves of Chichimec barbarians. After the fall of Tula, many of the Toltecs moved south and settled in the Valley of Mexico, founding several towns near Lake Texcoco. Over the years, they were joined by even more waves of Chichimecs, migrating into the valley from the north. The last wave of Chichimecs to come into this mixing pot was the tribe we know today as the Aztecs. Today we know a lot about the Aztecs because they wrote about themselves in books called codices. A codex was filled with illustrations as well as these picture symbols that are a form of writing. Newer codices, written after the Spanish colonists came to Mexico, contain descriptions of typical Aztec life, as well as traditional stories about their ancestors and their gods. These stories are called myths or legends. One such story recounts the mythical origin of the Aztec people. According to the legend, the Aztecs came from a land to the north where they lived in caves. They left this land to search for a new home in the south. They wandered for hundreds of years, accompanied on their journey by their god, Huitzilopochtli, whose name means hummingbird on the left. Despite his innocent name, Huitzilopochtli was a ferocious god of war. Huitzilopochtli told them to make their new home at the place where they saw this sign, an eagle eating the fruit of a cactus. In the Spanish version of the legend, the eagle is eating a snake, but to the Aztecs, the fruit of the cactus had symbolic meaning, for it represented the human heart. Finally, after centuries of wandering, they found the sign, and here they began to build a great city. The sign of Huitzilopochtli appeared in an unexpected place, on an island in Lake Texcoco. Much of the island was swampy and uninhabitable, but the Aztecs, obeying their fearsome god, began to live on the island. They founded not one, but two towns, Tlatelolco, and the city that was destined to become their capital, Tenochtitlan. To get to the mainland, they built elevated roads or causeways with bridges that could be drawn up if enemies approached. They also created more usable land by building chinampas, which were rectangular artificial islands. Chinampas were built next to the causeways and were separated by canals. The people could plant their gardens on the chinampas, or they could live on them. Today, some of these chinampas still exist, surrounded, as then, by canals. The Aztecs heaped up mud and reeds from the lake and planted trees or pounded sticks into the mud to hold the soil in place. But even though the Aztecs were able to create chinampas and sustain themselves on their little island, they were surrounded by enemies. For Tenochtitlan was encircled by older cities around the lake, such as Culhuacan, Chalco, and Xochimilco. But the Aztecs were able to ally themselves with a very powerful city of Azcapotzalco and then with Texcoco, and their power began to grow. For the Aztecs were skilled warriors. In brutal campaigns, they began to sweep across the Valley of Mexico. In the name of their terrible god of war, they struck terror throughout the land. Enemies captured in war were taken back to Tenochtitlan to be sacrificed on the altars of Huitzilopochtli, while the survivors were forced to pay tribute to their new masters. Aztec codices record the amounts of tribute paid in a single year: warrior costumes, shields, and headdresses, quantities of cocoa and gold, thousands of cotton garments, and tons of food. Tribute streamed into the capital from the farthest domains as the Aztecs pushed across Mesoamerica. They created an empire that reached from the central highlands to the Gulf of Mexico. Gorged with tribute, the capital grew into a dazzling city of canals, gardens, and temples, the fabulous Tenochtitlan. When the Spanish conqueror, Hernán Cortés, arrived here in 1519, he was stunned by the beauty of the city. He described a clean and radiant metropolis of palaces and shining temples, perfectly laid out along broad paved boulevards. Heads of mythical beasts guarded the temple stairways, while carved serpents and other images decorated the streets. Cortés also spoke of the beautiful markets of Tlatelolco, where people might go to barter for weavings or pottery, or where the lady of the house might go to buy tortillas, tamales, or salt. You could buy corn, nuts, or peppers, or ducks, or fish caught fresh from the lake. While merchants from faraway places like Oaxaca or Yucatan traded in gold and quetzal feathers. The people of noble blood and those warriors who had distinguished themselves most in battle were allowed by law to wear fine clothing in public, while the highest noble of all, the great king Moctezuma, was carried through the streets on a litter. But while the Spaniards were impressed by the magnificence of Tenochtitlan, they were not prepared for what they would find when they entered the temple district. When they climbed the stairways of the great temples, they discovered to their horror that the steps were covered with blood. And inside the sanctuaries, the odor of rotting blood overcame them, for the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice almost continuously. The method was not complicated. The chest of the victim was quickly opened with a stone knife, and the still-beating heart was removed. Blood was smeared across carved images of the gods, and then the heart was placed in a bowl and burned. By one estimate, the Aztecs sacrificed about 30,000 people every year. When a new temple to Huitzilopochtli was dedicated, some 20,000 people were killed in a span of 4 days. Near the center of the city, 135,000 skulls were displayed on a rack. The purpose of all this carnage was to feed the gods, for the gods were thought to be living beings that needed nourishment, blood and human hearts, to survive. For example, sacrifice caused Tlaloc, the rain god, to send life-giving rain, and sacrifice caused the sun god, Tonatiuh, to rise each day and move through the heavens. Tonatiuh lies at the center of the famous Aztec calendar stone. On each side are claws holding human hearts. This circular band contains the names of the 20 days of the Aztec month, such as lizard, stone knife, eagle, and reed. At the top we see the date, 13 Reed, when the present sun was born, and inside the 4 rectangles are the dates when the 4 previous suns were destroyed. The Aztecs believed that they were living under the fifth sun, which began during the time of Teotihuacan. They were constantly struggling through sacrifice to keep the fifth sun and the universe alive. The fall of the Aztec Empire was strangely foretold by one of their own legends. According to the legend, the god Quetzalcoatl, who had gone to live across the ocean, would return in the year 1 Reed to rule over the Aztecs. In one of the most extraordinary coincidences in all of human history, 1 Reed fell on the year 1519, precisely when Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico. Cortés, with his beard and white skin, looked like a god to the Aztecs. The king, Moctezuma, thinking Cortés might be a god, welcomed him into Tenochtitlan. But the Spaniards soon revealed why they had come: to convert the Indians to Christianity and to take their gold. Conflict was inevitable, and the outcome was never in doubt. The Aztec warriors fought bravely, but they were no match for Spanish armor and horses. And of course, the Spanish had guns. Taking stones from the Aztec temples, Cortés built a church. With this act, the new world was united with the old, and the final curtain came down on the 2,000-year history of the ancient Americans.